What if an entire town, 22 men, women, and children, sat down to dinner and never stood up again? Plates still warm, radio still humming, shoes lined neatly by the door, and then silence. Could you imagine walking into that? If you've ever lived through something unexplainable, drop your story in the comments. And while you're here, tell us, where are you watching from tonight? Your hometown might hold secrets too. The rain had not stopped for 3 days. It came in gray sheets down the slopes of Bryan County, turning the winding 2-lane roads into rivers of mud, painting the valleys in shades of black and silver. Sheriff Tom Harrington sat at his kitchen table in Ashwood, West Virginia, finishing the last bite of pot roast his wife had left him on a chipped plate. The clock on the wall read 8:47 p.m., Sunday night. Normally, Sundays in this part of the Appalachians were for football on TV, hot coffee after church, and the quiet comfort of routine. But the phone had been ringing too much, and when the dispatcher patched through the latest call, Tom set his fork down with a weight in his chest. A neighbor from outside the hollow said something was wrong in Ashwood Hollow, the tiny village tucked deeper into the ridges, maybe 20 minutes from town if you didn't mind driving switchbacks in the rain. The man had gone looking for a cousin earlier that afternoon. He claimed the houses were lit, but no one answered. He said the place looked empty, dead quiet, like a stage set after the actors all left. Tom had shrugged at first. Power went out all the time in storms like these, and mountain folk knew how to keep to themselves. But the call had been followed by another, then a third. By the time the fourth rang in, his dispatcher sounded spooked. Tom pushed back from the table, grabbed his Stetson and slicker, and stepped out into the cold. The October wind slapped him awake, carrying the smell of wet leaves and wood smoke from chimneys. He could hear the rush of the creek swollen by days of rain. By the time Deputy Mark Callahan pulled the cruiser into the gravel drive, Tom was already soaked through the shoulders. "Where we headed?" Mark asked, flipping the wipers back and forth as though it would matter against the sheets of rain. "Hollow Creek Road," Tom muttered, though the official name had long ago been replaced in local mouths with Ashwood Hollow. "Got folks calling in saying it looks wrong." "Wrong how?" Tom didn't answer. He just lit a cigarette and watched the smoke curl against the fogged window until the flames sputtered in the draft. He'd been sheriff of Bryan County for nearly 20 years. He had seen drownings, mine cave-ins, car wrecks that left whole families broken in a single night. He'd seen ugly things, but he'd never heard so many people describe a place as simply wrong. The drive into Ashwood Hollow was treacherous. Their cruiser tires slid on wet asphalt, headlights catching deer eyes and the sagging posts of barbed wire fences. Mark kept both hands locked on the wheel, his knuckles pale, while Tom stared into the dark like he expected something to step out at any moment. When the first houses appeared through the curtain of rain, Tom felt the hair prickle on the back of his neck. The village should have been alive even in bad weather. Porch lights, the glow of TVs through curtains, maybe the shadow of someone walking from barn to house. Instead, Ashwood Hollow looked like it had been frozen mid-breath. Windows glowed faintly. Front doors stood ajar, rocking against their frames. Curtains fluttered in the breeze, but not a soul moved. "Jesus," Mark whispered. "Where is everybody?" Tom told him to park. They stepped out into the mud, flashlights cutting white cones through the mist. The rain pattered off tin roofs, gurgled through clogged gutters, dripped down their collars. For a long moment, the only sound was water. "Let's check the Whitaker place," Tom said. He knew James and Marlene Whitaker well enough. Their boy, Danny, played ball with his nephew. Salt of the earth family, never any trouble. They pushed through the front gate, its hinges squealing, and stepped onto the porch. The door hung wide open, a coat dripping rainwater by the frame. Inside smelled of roast beef and potatoes. A pot sat cooling on the stove, plates of food half finished on the table. A glass of milk had tipped and soaked a pile of mail, the ink bleeding into shapeless blue smears. The TV hummed softly in the living room, tuned to a Sunday night game. Everything screamed ordinary life, except for the emptiness. Tom moved room to room, calling names. Beds unmade, clothes laid out for morning, a lamp still burning in the den. The Whitakers had been living their lives one moment, and then gone. He found the family dog, Jasper, a black and white collie, whining in the backyard, ribs showing from hunger. The animal pawed at the sliding door, desperate for food and comfort. Tom scratched its wet fur and felt his throat tighten. "Sheriff," Mark called from the porch. His flashlight trembled slightly as he pointed at the railing. There, lined up with deliberate neatness, were 3 pairs of shoes, a man's boots, a woman's flats, and a boy's sneakers. All placed side by side, soles pointing outward, as though waiting for inspection. Tom stared at them until the rain blurred his vision. "Why would they leave their shoes?" Mark asked. Tom didn't answer. He didn't have one. They checked the Adler house next, then the Colemans. Each time the story repeated like a broken record. Meals left out, radios still on, shoes set neatly by doors or porches. In one house, a bowl of cereal had gone soggy in milk. In another, a baby's crib stood empty, the mobile still spinning lazily overhead. No sign of struggle, no broken locks or forced entries. Just absence, as if 22 people had walked out together into the storm and left their lives behind. By midnight, Tom's raincoat clung heavy to his shoulders. His boots squelched with each step, and the holler rang with nothing but the thud of rain. They gathered in front of the shuttered general store, its windows reflecting their flashlight beams. "No sign of foul play," Tom said finally, his voice low. "No tracks leading out, no vehicles missing. Just gone." Mark swallowed hard. Where the hell did they go? Tom stared into the fog. He had no answer. His gut told him something he'd never admit. They hadn't left in any way a man could explain. Something had taken them. They searched 3 more homes before exhaustion forced them back to the cruiser. Tom sat on the hood, cigarette smoke mixing with mist, watching the dark line of trees beyond the last house. He thought of his father, who used to say the mountains remembered things people wanted to forget. Tom had laughed then. Tonight, he wasn't laughing. Mark paced nervously by the cruiser. "Sheriff, I don't like this. It feels wrong, like the whole town just got up and marched into the woods." Tom didn't respond. He was listening. There, just under the sound of rain, something threaded the silence. At first, he thought it was wind catching in the eaves, but the sound grew clearer, sharper, lighter, high-pitched. Laughter, children's laughter. Soft, distant, carried on the wet night air from somewhere in the woods. Tom froze. His heart hammered in his chest. He turned slowly toward the tree line. The sound swelled for a breath, then faded, swallowed by the storm. He glanced at Mark. The young deputy's face was pale, his flashlight trembling. "You heard it too," Tom said, more statement than question. Mark nodded, lips pressed tight. "Tell me I imagined that." Tom ground his cigarette into the gravel and forced his voice steady. "We'll call it in at dawn. Until then, not a word. You understand?" Mark hesitated, then nodded, but his eyes darted back to the woods, as though expecting shapes to emerge at any moment. They climbed into the cruiser, mud dripping from their boots. Tom stared at the windshield, at the blurred outlines of houses still glowing faintly in the rain. Places waiting for occupants, who would never return. His gut clenched with a certainty he could not shake. Ashwood Hollow hadn't been abandoned. It had been emptied. As the wipers dragged across the glass, a new sound came, faint but sharp enough to cut through the storm. A single knock, then another. From the woods, echoing like knuckles on hollow doors. Tom's hands tightened on the steering wheel. His mouth went dry. He told himself it was just branches snapping, just the storm playing tricks. But when the knocking stopped, silence pressed down heavier than rain. And then, just before he put the cruiser in gear, the laughter came again, closer this time, as if the children had stepped out of the trees and were watching from the dark. The storm broke at dawn, but the rain had left scars. Streams of muddy water cut down the hillsides, turning Briar County's back roads into washboards of gravel and clay. Fog clung stubbornly to the ridges, drifting in pale sheets across the 2-lane blacktop. From above, Ashwood Hollow looked ordinary again. A scattering of farmhouses, a one-room chapel, a shuttered general store, all nestled in the crook of the valley like a child's playset. But Sheriff Tom Harrington knew better. The houses stood like open mouths, waiting for voices that would never return. He had been awake all night, His office smelled of stale coffee and wet wool. Deputy Mark Callahan sat slouched in the chair across from him, boots caked in mud, eyelids twitching, as though he hadn't stopped hearing the laughter. Neither of them spoke of it. Not yet. They didn't have to. The fear hung between them like smoke. By 9 o'clock, the cavalry had arrived. Black SUVs rolled down Hollow Creek Road in a convoy, their tires hissing on the wet asphalt. When the doors opened, the quiet mountain morning was broken by the snap of radios and the clipped voices of federal agents. They wore dark jackets with bold yellow letters on the back FBI. Their movements were precise, efficient, practiced. Men and women with hard eyes stepped into the mud as if they'd done this 1,000 times. For them, Ashwood Hollow was another case file, another anomaly. For Tom, it was his home. The woman who led them didn't bother with pleasantries. She strode toward him with long steps, her coat whipping in the breeze, and extended a firm hand. "Sheriff Harrington," she said. "Special Agent Rebecca Crow, Federal Bureau of Investigation." Tom shook her hand. Her grip was strong, her gaze sharper. She was tall, with dark hair tied back in a no-nonsense knot and eyes the color of storm clouds. Nothing in her expression gave away what she was thinking. That unsettled him more than anger or pity ever could. "You've secured the scene?" she asked. "As best we can," Tom replied, glancing around at the glowing windows and open doors. "But the whole damn village is a scene." Crow followed his gaze. "Then we'll start house by house." That night, Ashwood Hollow lit up brighter than it ever had in living memory. Portable floodlights bathed the valley in a harsh white glow, turning each house into a theater stage. Agents moved in and out, like restless actors, bagging evidence, half-eaten meals, fingerprints lifted from doorknobs, scraps of clothing left on chairs. Forensic vans hummed. Radios crackled with orders. Dogs barked as handlers tugged them through the mud, searching for trails. Helicopters circled above, their beams cutting across the ridges like searchlights in wartime. The entire hollow looked less like a town and more like a battlefield being mapped by invaders. Tom stood at the edge of the chaos, cigarette trembling in his fingers. He had worked law enforcement for 25 years. He had seen murders, suicides, wrecks, so violent you had to scrape lives off asphalt. But he had never seen a crime where nothing made sense. No footprints leading out, no vehicles missing, no sign of resistance. Just a town frozen mid-breath. He wanted answers, but the deeper he looked, the more it felt like the mountain itself was holding its breath. Deputy Mark paced near him, arms crossed tight. "They're not going to find a damn thing," he muttered. His voice cracked from exhaustion. "Because it's not human." Tom shot him a warning glance. "Watch your mouth." Mark's jaw tightened. He wanted to say more, but swallowed it down. Crow was already watching them from across the yard, her face unreadable. By the third day, the press had descended. Satellite trucks lined the winding road like vultures perched on a wire. Reporters shoved microphones into the faces of anyone willing to talk. The phrase appeared on every network chyron. The vanished village. The story was irresistible. 22 people gone without a trace. Homes left perfectly intact. Cable news anchors speculated wildly. Mass suicide, cult activity, environmental poisoning, alien abduction. Every theory seemed more far-fetched than the last, yet none explained the reality of warm dinners and shoes left neatly by doors. Tom hated the cameras most of all. He'd spent his career in quiet corners, cleaning up small tragedies that rarely made it beyond the county line. Now the whole country was watching. He stared at the flashing bulbs, the reporters shouting questions, and felt his cigarette burn down to the filter. "If I knew," he told one of them flatly, "we wouldn't be standing here." But inside, he was haunted. Because late that second night, as he walked past the chapel alone, he had heard it again, the laughter. Children's laughter, soft and distant, floating from the woods. He hadn't told anyone. Not yet. What lawman admits to hearing ghosts? The third morning dawned gray and damp, fog clinging like cobwebs to the hills. Crow approached him with a clipboard in hand, looking impossibly awake for someone who had worked through the night. "We've gone through 12 houses so far," she said, her voice cool, professional. "The details are consistent." Tom nodded grimly. Shoes lined up, meals left out, radios still humming. Not a sign of where they went. Her mouth tightened. Even she, with all her federal training, looked unsettled. "What's your theory, Sheriff?" Tom exhaled smoke. "You want it straight?" "I don't have one." "Convenient," Crow muttered, jotting notes. She didn't press further, but Tom could see it in her eyes. She didn't like mysteries. Mysteries had a way of making agents look like fools. By noon, the search expanded beyond the village. Teams of dogs combed the woods, handlers calling into the mist. State troopers walked shoulder to shoulder through fields, marking grids with fluorescent tape. The creek that gave Ashwood Hollow its name was dragged, its black waters swirling under floodlights. But still nothing. Not a single clue. Reporters whispered that it looked staged, like someone meant for them to find the hollow this way. Tom overheard one cameraman say it under his breath and nearly snapped. The idea gnawed at him, though. Had the villagers chosen to leave? Had they been following something? That night, the FBI set up their command post inside the chapel. The pews were shoved aside to make room for maps, radios, and evidence bags stacked in neat piles. Floodlights outside painted the stained glass in harsh panes of red and blue. The air smelled of damp wood and coffee gone stale. The chapel, once a place of prayer, now resembled a war room. Tom lingered near the back, watching the agents argue over timelines and evidence. Crow stood at the front, pointing to a map of Briar County. "There are no recent missing persons reports outside Ashwood Hollow," she said. "No indication of mass travel. Phones were left behind. Vehicles too. The disappearance is contained." "Could they have walked out?" one agent asked. "Through miles of mud and forest? All 22 of them?" The room murmured. No one wanted to say what they were thinking. Tom rubbed the stiffness from his neck, his heart pounding. He thought again of the laughter, of how it had seemed to float through the trees like smoke. He had told no one. Not yet. When the meeting broke, Crow caught him by the door. "You look like you want to say something." Tom hesitated. "I don't have proof. Proof comes later." "What is it?" He lowered his voice. "The first night, I thought I heard children. Outside, near the woods." Her expression didn't change, but her eyes sharpened. And that was before I knew all the kids were gone." For the first time, Crow looked unsettled. She adjusted her grip on the clipboard, then spoke quietly. "Sheriff, you'll need to write that down." The words sat heavy in his chest as he drove back through the hollow later that night. The floodlights hummed, the houses glowed faintly, and just as he turned onto the main road, he heard it again, soft, high-pitched, drifting on the fog. Children's laughter. Not distant this time. Close. Too close. He slammed the brakes, headlights sweeping across the tree line. For a split second, he swore he saw movement, pale shapes darting between the trunks. By the time he blinked, they were gone. The laughter faded, swallowed by the woods. Tom sat frozen, his hands trembling on the wheel. His deputy stirred in the passenger seat, eyes wide. "Sheriff, tell me you heard that too." Tom nodded once, unable to speak. The silence that followed pressed heavier than the mountains themselves. Morning light never felt so unwelcome. It seeped through the fog over Ashwood Hollow like a weak promise, pale and cold, unable to warm anything it touched. Sheriff Tom Harrington stood on the chapel steps with a cup of coffee gone bitter and lukewarm, watching the fog cling stubbornly to the valley. Floodlights were being hauled back into trucks, and exhausted agents shuffled like ghosts between the houses. He had smoked too many cigarettes. His throat felt like ash. Deputy Mark Callahan hadn't said more than 10 words since the night before. He looked gray, older than his 26 years. Tom recognized the hollow-eyed stare. Mark was carrying something heavy, maybe heavier than he could handle. The laughter had gotten to him. Tom wanted to tell the boy it would get easier, but he knew it wouldn't. Not with what they had heard, and what they might yet see. The Whitaker house became their next focus. Crow insisted on rechecking each home, this time with meticulous evidence sweeps. They moved like surgeons through the rooms, gloved hands, tweezers, little baggies. Tom followed reluctantly, his boots leaving wet prints on hardwood floors that had once held family dinners and Sunday mornings. He had always thought of James and Marlene Whitaker as solid folks. James fixed tractors, Marlene ran bake sales at the school. Their boy Danny had the kind of smile that made teachers brag. Seeing their house this way, plates crusted with gravy, homework half finished on the table, a jacket still dripping rain by the door was like trespassing on a life paused mid-breath. "Sheriff," one of the techs called softly from the attic stairs. "You'll want to see this." Tom ducked his head under the low rafters and climbed up, flashlight beams sweeping through dust motes. The attic smelled of cedar and mouse droppings. Old trunks lined the corners, relics of lives before his time. But at the far end, where the chimney met the slanted roof, a loose board had been pried open. Inside the gap lay a bundle wrapped in cloth, sealed with wax that had long ago cracked. Crow's voice sharpened. "Don't touch it. Bag it." The bundle was laid gently on the dining table downstairs. Agents gathered, their flashlights bouncing. Crow peeled the cloth back with gloved fingers. Inside lay a leather-bound book, its cover worn soft, edges frayed, the faint scent of mildew rising from its pages. On the first leaf, written in faded ink, was a name. Clara Whitaker, 1956. Tom's breath caught. He knew the name. Clara had been James's aunt, long dead by all accounts. Yet here was her voice, caught in paper, staring back at him across nearly half a century. Crow turned pages carefully. The handwriting was neat at first, delicate loops, steady strokes. The entries began innocently enough. The 2nd of April, 1956. "The nights are long here, but I love the quiet. Thomas says we are lucky to live apart from the world. I believe him. And yet sometimes when the wind passes through the trees, it feels like voices travel with it." Tom rubbed his jaw. He felt suddenly like an intruder, reading a prayer not meant for outsiders. But Crow pressed on. May 17. Margaret Barrett woke screaming last night. She swore she heard children playing outside her window. When Thomas checked, the yard was empty. The laughter did not stop until dawn. A chill threaded down Tom's spine. Laughter. Always the laughter. Crow read aloud, her voice steady but lower now, as though the words themselves carried weight. June 3. Father Oliver preached against fear. He told us the devil prowls in lonely places, but the Lord protects us. Still, I saw his hands trembling when the voices began, even as he spoke from the pulpit. Mark shifted uneasily in his chair, knuckles white against his coffee mug. Tom caught his deputy's eyes, both of them silently acknowledging the echo between past and present. The entries began to warp as the weeks went by. Sentences broke, ink smudged, the careful loops turned jagged. June 21. The children have stopped speaking. All of them. They only laugh. Their parents pretend not to notice, but when I look in their eyes, I do not see children anymore, only hunger. A hush fell over the room. Even the hum of the forensic lights seemed to dull. Tom's throat closed tight. He felt a sudden, irrational urge to close the book, to shut Clara back inside the past where she belonged. But Crow's hands kept moving. July 9. We are told not to resist, that to resist is worse than death. I do not know who tells us. The voice comes from the earth, from the trees, from our own children's mouths. Thomas says it is nearly time. He kissed me tonight and said we would not be afraid, but I saw tears in his eyes. He has carved the spiral into our door just like the others. He says it is a promise. I think it is a mark of surrender. Tom had heard stories as a boy. Whispers of strange happenings in the hollow, old families vanishing, crops failing, livestock found mutilated. He had dismissed them as backwoods tales. But here was evidence in ink, a woman half a century ago, describing exactly what he had begun to fear. Crow turned to the last page. The handwriting staggered across the paper, letters slanted, desperate. July 23. They came to every door. They said, "It is tonight." The children led the way, holding hands, singing. My neighbors followed. Thomas followed. I do not want to go, but I cannot stay. The spiral burns in my eyes even when I close them. It is beautiful. It is terrible. If I do not write again, know that we fed him. Know that we had no choice. The ink trailed into a smear, as though the pen had been dragged away. The silence in the Whitaker dining room was suffocating. No one moved, no one spoke. The book lay between them like a living thing, whispering from the past. Finally, Crow closed the cover with a snap that made half the agents flinch. "Bag it," she ordered. The others dispersed, but Tom remained rooted, staring at the journal. He imagined Clara, candle flickering, scribbling those last words with shaking hands. He tried to picture her walking out into the night behind her neighbors, her own child perhaps giggling with that inhuman laughter. It wasn't just a disappearance. It was surrender. Later, as dusk fell again, Tom stood outside the chapel smoking, the journal's words gnawing at his thoughts. Mark joined him, face pale. "Sheriff," he said, voice low, "what if they weren't taken? What if they went willingly?" Tom flicked ash into the mud. "That's worse," he muttered. Before either could say more, one of the forensic techs came running from the cemetery behind the chapel, his boots slipping in the muck. "Sheriff, Agent Crow, you need to see this." They followed him through the fog toward the graves. The radar had been running sweeps all afternoon, a steady beep-beep as it mapped the earth below. Now the machine stood silent beside an open pit. The soil was dark, freshly turned. The tech pointed, his gloved hand trembling. "We've got anomalies, big voids beneath the graves. And, Sheriff, some of them aren't coffins." Tom's stomach clenched. Crow's jaw set hard. They stepped closer, peering down into the yawning black of the pit. The air rising from it was damp, metallic, like rust and rot. The journal's final words pulsed in Tom's mind, louder than his heartbeat. "We fed him. We had no choice." The cemetery behind Ashwood Chapel had always been quiet. Nestled against the tree line, it was the kind of place where families gathered on Sundays with flowers and whispered prayers, where headstones leaned with age but still bore the names of generations. Sheriff Tom Harrington remembered walking through here as a boy, listening to his father talk about the families that built the hollow with their hands and their faith. Those graves, he'd been told, were sacred. But standing there now, with floodlights glaring across the rows and the muddy pits yawning open, Tom knew those stories had been lies, or at least half-truths. The ground-penetrating radar had lit up like a Christmas tree. Technicians flagged anomalies all across the cemetery, shallow voids beneath stones, irregular shapes that didn't match coffins. By mid-afternoon, crews had begun to dig. The first shovel struck something hard after just 2 feet. What emerged was not a coffin, but a crude wooden box, no larger than a child's toy chest. The wood splintered as they pried it open, revealing a tangle of bones. Some were tiny, bird-like, others clearly human. They weren't arranged like a body. They were piled, as though tossed together without care. The stench that rose from the box turned men pale. One agent gagged into the mud. Another crossed herself. Tom forced himself to look, though bile burned the back of his throat. The bones were old, some yellowed with time, others stained dark as though burned. But what chilled him most was that they weren't all ancient. Some still carried fragments of flesh, strands of hair clinging stubbornly to skulls. Crow crouched close, her face set hard as granite. "Bag them all, every fragment, every piece." Her voice was steady, but Tom noticed her hand trembled when she adjusted her gloves. The second pit revealed worse. Another box, heavier, the lid nailed shut. When they pried it open, a cracked porcelain doll's head rolled into the mud. Inside were bones again, but this time arranged carefully, almost lovingly, in a circle. At the center of that circle lay a child's shoe, a rusted nail driven clean through the sole. Tom's stomach turned. He stepped back, clutching his hat like it might anchor him. "What kind of people?" Mark whispered behind him, but he didn't finish. His words floated away into the mist, unfinished like so much else in this hollow. By evening, they had unearthed 5 boxes. Each was worse than the last. One held a bird's skull wrapped in string. Another, a bundle of bones carved with strange symbols, spirals, jagged lines that seemed to writhe when the light hit them. The worst was the 5th. Inside lay a child's skull no bigger than a grapefruit, its crown carved with deliberate markings, not random scratches, but patterns. Tom didn't recognize them, but he knew instinctively they were older than the village, older than his county, maybe older than the country itself. The younger agents whispered among themselves, voices sharp with unease. One muttered about cults, another about devil worship, a third about the old folk tales he'd heard as a kid in Kentucky. Crow silenced them with a look, but Tom could see the fear in her eyes too. She was no longer dismissing the idea of rituals or folklore. She was staring straight at it. Dr. Ellen Lively, the anthropologist flown in from Dallas, arrived that night. She was a small woman with sharp features, her glasses fogging in the rain as she bent over the artifacts. She didn't speak for a long time, just traced the carvings on the bones with gloved fingers, her breath shallow. "These are not random," she finally whispered. "This is ritual, pre-Christian in style, though distorted. I've seen similar sites in rural Europe, fertility cults, blood cults, but never in America. Not like this." Tom shivered at the certainty in her voice. He had wanted her to say it was a hoax, some twisted prank from decades ago, but her tone carried no doubt. This was real. This was deliberate. The chapel became a morgue that night. Tables lined with evidence bags, photographs pinned to corkboards, bones catalogued one by one. The air smelled of damp earth and bleach. Tom lingered near the back, smoking until Crow snapped at him to put it out. His nerves were frayed, his hands unsteady. He couldn't stop picturing Clara Whitaker writing by candlelight in 1956, scribbling, "We fed him. We had no choice." He imagined her voice merging with the laughter they'd heard in the trees. Was this what she had meant? Feeding him with their dead? Just past midnight, one of the agents screamed. Tom rushed back outside, his boots slipping in the mud. A young FBI man stumbled out of the Adler house, his face white as chalk, flashlight shaking in his grip. "What happened?" Crow demanded. The man stammered, eyes wide. I saw someone. Inside. A man standing in the hallway." Crow's jaw hardened. "One of us?" The agent shook his head violently. "No, he was tall, too tall, and his face—" He broke off, trembling. "I don't want to say." They swept the house with floodlights. Every room stood empty, dust settling in the beams. Nothing. Yet Tom noticed how all the agents exchanged nervous glances. The Hollow was working on them. It was wearing them down. Later, Tom found himself back at the cemetery, standing at the edge of the pits. The rain had eased, but fog clung low, rolling across the ground like breath from unseen mouths. He stared at the fifth box, at the carved skull inside. He tried to make sense of the markings, but they seemed to shift under his gaze, pulling him in. He blinked hard and looked away, heart pounding. Mark joined him, pale and jumpy. "Sheriff," he whispered, "what if they didn't disappear? What if they're still here? Waiting?" Tom didn't answer. He couldn't, because part of him believed it. The next morning, the digging continued. More boxes, more bones. Some human, some not. Each discovery darker than the last. Crow kept her face composed, but Tom noticed the way she clenched her jaw, the way her eyes flicked nervously toward the woods. Even the scientist, Dr. Lively, began to mutter under her breath, her neat handwriting in the evidence log growing more erratic with each entry. By mid-afternoon, a shout rose from the far corner of the cemetery. Tom ran to the pit, boots sinking deep in the muck. What he saw made his stomach lurch. The earth had collapsed into a hollow space. Beneath the grave, marked Eleanor Whitaker, 1898, 1919, the soil gave way to reveal a chamber, larger than any coffin, darker than any root cellar. A void hidden beneath the graves all along. Crow's face went pale. "Seal it off," she ordered. "No one goes down until we know what we're dealing with." But Tom couldn't tear his eyes away from the darkness. The air that rose from it was different, colder, damp, with the metallic tang of rust and blood. He felt as though the earth itself was exhaling, sighing in relief that it had finally been uncovered. That night, Tom sat alone in the chapel, the carved skull sealed in an evidence bag on the table before him. He poured a shot of whiskey from the bottle he kept hidden in his desk drawer, though he'd sworn off drinking years ago. His hands trembled as he lifted the glass. The carvings on the skull seemed to pulse in the lamplight, lines shifting when he wasn't looking. He downed the whiskey in one swallow, but the whispers came anyway. "Sheriff." The voice was low, drawn out, almost mocking. "Sheriff, don't resist." Tom spun, heart hammering. The chapel was empty, but the air smelled faintly of soil, damp and rotten. He gripped the bottle like a weapon, his breath coming fast. "Who's there?" His voice cracked in the rafters. Only silence answered. But when he turned back to the evidence table, his blood froze. The skull was no longer where he had left it. The bag lay empty, the lamplight glinting off bare plastic. The skull itself sat upright on the table, its carved crown facing him directly, as though it had shifted on its own. Tom stumbled back, his chair scraping across the floor. The carved spirals seemed to glow faintly, pulling his gaze, drawing him inward. His vision blurred, his knees weak, and then, just as suddenly, the light flickered. The skull sat still, motionless, exactly where it had been bagged. The whispers vanished. Only his ragged breath remained. He rubbed his eyes, convinced he had lost his mind. But as he stumbled toward the door, he heard it again, soft, high-pitched, cutting through the fog outside. Children's laughter. Not far this time, not across the valley, right at the edge of the cemetery. The woods around Ashwood Hollow had always been thick, a tangle of oak, cedar, and pine that seemed to grow closer together the deeper you walked. Old-timers used to joke that the forest was alive, that it didn't just surround the hollow but swallowed it whole. Sheriff Tom Harrington had laughed at those stories as a boy. Now, as he stood at the tree line with a shotgun slung heavy across his chest, he wasn't laughing anymore. It was dawn. Mist clung low to the ground, curling between the gravestones of the cemetery and rolling into the trees beyond. The floodlights had been packed away, leaving only the pale light of morning to filter through the canopy. The agents stood in a line, weapons at the ready, radios clipped to their shoulders. Deputy Mark Callahan was beside Tom, his jaw tight, his eyes hollow from another sleepless night. Agent Rebecca Crow was at the center, her voice sharp as she gave orders. "We move in grid formation. No one breaks line. No one goes silent. We mark everything. Understand?" A chorus of nods answered her, but no one spoke. Even the forest seemed to listen, holding its breath. They stepped forward as one. The air changed instantly. It was cooler, heavier. Sound died quickly here. The crunch of boots on leaves was swallowed almost as soon as it rose. Tom felt the weight of the shotgun strap bite into his shoulder, the rhythm of his breath louder than it should have been. Every tree looked the same. Every shadow seemed to shift when he wasn't looking. Within half an hour they found the first sight. A ring of stones half buried in leaves, blackened as though from fire long ago. In the ashes, brittle and white, lay a jawbone. Flat teeth. Human. One of the agents gagged, but Crow's voice cut sharp through the mist. "Bag it, mark the site, move on." The second sight was worse. Wooden poles driven into the ground in a rough circle, their tops carved with spirals and jagged lines. Weather had worn the grooves, but the markings were still visible. Dr. Ellen Lively, the anthropologist, crouched beside them, her hands trembling as she traced the carvings. "These are old," she whispered, "older than the village. I've only seen similar designs in Europe, pagan fertility rituals, harvest sacrifices, but this," she trailed off, eyes wide. "This is something else, something homegrown, a distortion. Isolation does that." Tom felt the air grow heavier. He stepped back, scanning the trees, convinced he saw movement in the periphery. Every instinct told him they weren't alone. The third sight nearly broke the line. A pit dug deep into the soil, filled with bones layer upon layer like sediment, some crumbling to dust, others disturbingly fresh. The stench hit them before they saw it. Several agents covered their mouths, retching. Crow's face went hard, but Tom caught the way her eyes flicked nervously toward the shadows. "They've been doing this for decades," Dr. Lively said quietly, her voice thin. "Maybe longer. This isn't a crime scene, it's a tradition. The word settled over them like frost. A tradition. Tom's stomach clenched. He thought of Clara Whitaker's journal, her final line. We fed him. We had no choice. Had the people of Ashwood Hollow known all along what lived in these woods? The team pressed deeper, their line fraying at the edges. The trees grew thicker, shutting out more of the light. Radios crackled with static, then silence. Tom felt sweat on his back despite the cold. The forest pressed close, the mist heavier with every step. He could hear his own heartbeat like a drum. Then it started. Soft at first, almost like wind threading through branches. But wind didn't laugh. Children's laughter. High-pitched. Gleeful. It echoed all around them. Impossible to place. Hold, Tom barked, raising his hand. The agents froze, flashlights sweeping wildly through the mist. Contact? Crow demanded. Tom shook his head, though his skin prickled. Sound only. The laughter swelled, weaving between the trees, darting just out of reach. Mark's flashlight trembled in his grip. His voice was low, ragged. Sheriff, tell me I'm not the only one. You're not, Tom said flatly. The laughter shifted then, twining with something else. A deeper voice, rough, guttural, the syllables curling unnaturally in their ears. Not English, not anything Tom recognized. But the intent was clear, it was calling. Beckoning. One of the younger agents panicked. This is Bullsh. His voice broke as he fired into the trees. The blast echoed like thunder, birds erupting into the air, but the laughter didn't stop. It grew louder. Closer. Cease fire, Crow snapped, her voice cutting sharp. Hold the line. Tom raised his shotgun, scanning the mist. His breath came fast, each inhale shallow. He thought of Clara's words again, of how the children had led the procession. He wondered if he was hearing them now, the same voices, half a century later, still laughing in the dark. The forest grew quiet suddenly. Too quiet. Even the mist seemed to pause. Tom felt every muscle in his body tense. And then Mark hissed, voice sharp with terror. Sheriff, look. Tom turned. Between the trees, pale shapes moved. Dozens of them. Men, women, children. Their faces faint in the mist. Indistinct but unmistakably human. They walked slowly, deliberately, as though in procession. Tom's heart hammered. It's them. Crow's voice rose. Hold positions. Nobody fires. The figures kept coming, their outlines sharp and pale against the fog. As they drew closer, Tom saw the truth. Their eyes glowed faintly, like milk catching moonlight. Their mouths curved into smiles too wide, too knowing. Not victims, not survivors, believers. The agents shifted uneasily, some raising weapons despite orders. Tom couldn't move. He felt rooted, his gaze locked on the pale faces drifting between the trees. His chest tightened. They weren't walking randomly. They were forming a line, a path. And all of them, every glowing eye was fixed on him. The laughter swelled again, high and cruel. Tom's breath caught. For a moment, he thought he saw Clara Whitaker among them, her face pale, her eyes hollow. She raised one hand, pointing deeper into the woods, toward the ridge. The figures turned as one, following her lead, vanishing slowly into the mist. Their outlines dissolved like smoke. The forest swallowed them whole. The line of agents was broken. Radios crackled with panic. One man stumbled backward, another cursed under his breath. Crow barked orders, trying to pull them back into formation, but no one was listening. Tom stood frozen, shotgun slack in his hands. His pulse thundered in his ears. He couldn't shake the image of Clara's face, pointing the way. Mark grabbed his arm. Sheriff, did you see her? Tom swallowed hard, his throat dry. I saw her. Where were they going? Tom turned his gaze toward the ridge, where the mist still lingered like a curtain. The laughter had stopped, but the silence was worse. Heavy. Expectant. They were leading us, he whispered. Crow heard him. Her face was pale, her eyes sharper than ever. Or luring us. Tom didn't answer. He knew the truth, though he hated it. Clara hadn't pointed them away. She had pointed them forward. to the heart of whatever lay waiting in these woods. The ridge rose like a dark spine against the mist. Sheriff Tom Harrington stared at it from the cemetery's edge, his chest tight, his heart still pounding with the echoes of laughter. The forest seemed to lean closer now, pressing in around Ashwood Hollow like a predator testing its prey. The figures they had seen, the villagers, pale and glowing, had moved with such calm purpose. They hadn't scattered, hadn't fled. They had pointed the way, and Tom couldn't shake the thought that following them might be the only way to understand what had happened here, or the last mistake he'd ever make. Agent Rebecca Crow's voice cut through the fog. "We move at first light, full sweep up the ridge." Her tone was steel, but Tom caught the faint tremor beneath it. She was rattled. They all were. Deputy Mark Callahan muttered beside him, "Sheriff, we can't follow them. You saw their eyes. That wasn't human." Tom exhaled smoke, the cigarette trembling between his fingers. "Doesn't matter what it was. We don't have a choice." Crow turned her sharp gaze on both men. "We do this by the book. Grid formation. Weapons at the ready. No one moves ahead of the line." She paused, her voice lower. "And if anyone hears the laughter again, you don't follow it. You hold your ground." The agents nodded, but their eyes betrayed them. Fear had already seeped in like damp through old floorboards. By dawn, the team assembled at the base of the ridge. The fog clung heavier here, curling between tree trunks, swallowing light. Radios crackled with static, but little else. Tom adjusted his shotgun, his shoulders aching with fatigue. He glanced at Mark, who looked like he hadn't slept in days. His deputy's lips moved silently, maybe a prayer, maybe just his nerves bleeding out in whispers. The climb was brutal. Mud sucked at their boots, roots clawed at their ankles, branches lashed their faces. Every step felt like moving deeper into a place that did not want them. The forest grew darker as they climbed, though the sun was well above the horizon. Sound vanished. No birds, no wind, only the rasp of breath and the crunch of boots. It felt like trespassing on something ancient. Halfway up, they found the first sign. A spiral carved fresh into the bark of a cedar tree, sap still bleeding. Tom ran his fingers over the grooves, sticky, sharp-edged. It hadn't been there long. "They're showing us the way," Mark whispered. Crow shot him a glare. "Or they're setting the trap." Tom didn't answer. His gut told him both could be true. The deeper they pressed, the stranger the woods became. Clearings dotted the path, each holding evidence of something ritualistic. One bore a circle of ash with feathers scattered across it, blackened and brittle. Another held wooden poles lashed together in a crude shape, part cross, part spiral, part something unrecognizable. The smell of rot hung heavy in the air. Dr. Ellen Lively, the anthropologist, examined each site with trembling hands. Her voice shook as she scribbled notes. "These markings, they're not just random. They echo petroglyphs thousands of years old. This is syncretic pagan symbols distorted by generations, a folk religion grown in isolation." Tom stared at the spirals, his chest heavy. "You're saying this isn't new?" Lively shook her head. "No. I think the settlers here tapped into something older, or it tapped into them." The words gnawed at Tom. He thought of Clara Whitaker's journal, of the way she wrote, "We fed him. We had no choice." Was this what she meant? Not madness, but obedience passed down like an heirloom? By late afternoon, the line was faltering. Agents were exhausted, nerves fraying. The ridge seemed endless, its slope steep and unyielding. Tom forced himself forward, each step heavier than the last. That was when the sound returned. Laughter, high, sweet, childlike. It drifted through the trees, not distant this time, but close, circling them like wolves. The line froze. Flashlights snapped on, beams slicing wildly through the mist. Mark's breath hitched. "Sheriff, it's right here." Tom raised his shotgun, heart hammering. The laughter swelled, weaving around them, impossible to track. And then, beneath it, came the deeper voice again. Low, guttural words curling in a tongue that scraped at their ears. Crow barked, "Hold formation. Nobody move." But one of the younger agents broke. His flashlight swung wildly as he stumbled toward the trees, muttering, I see them. I see them. Agent, stop, Crow shouted, but it was too late. The mist swallowed him whole. Tom lunged forward, but the laughter crescendoed, drowning everything. It felt like needles in his skull, like the sound itself was pushing him back. By the time the silence returned, the agent was gone. No footsteps, no sound of struggle, just gone. Crow's jaw tightened, her eyes glistening with fury she didn't show. We keep moving. Her voice was flat, but Tom could hear the crack forming. As dusk fell, they reached the crest of the ridge. The forest opened into a wide clearing, and what they saw froze them all. Figures, dozens of them, pale, glowing faintly in the half-light. Men, women, children, the vanished of Ashwood Hollow. They stood in single file, barefoot, their eyes glowing like milk under moonlight, their mouths curved into serene smiles. Tom's stomach dropped. "It's them," he whispered. The villagers didn't move at first. They just stood, waiting, their silence more deafening than the laughter. Then, as one, they raised their hands and pointed toward the far side of the clearing. At the base of the next rise loomed a dark opening in the earth. A cavern, its mouth framed by rough-hewn stones, spirals carved deep into their surfaces. Torches burned on either side, flames crackling though no one had lit them. The villagers turned and began to walk, single file, into the earth. Their pale forms vanished into the cavern one by one, until only the glow of torches remained. Mark whispered, "Sheriff, they're not victims. They're part of it." Tom couldn't answer. His throat was tight, his hands numb around the shotgun. He could still see Clara Whitaker's face among them, her pale smile, her hand beckoning him forward. Crow's voice trembled, though she tried to mask it with command. "We follow. We end this tonight." Tom glanced at her, then at the dark mouth of the cavern. Every instinct screamed to turn back, but he knew there was no turning back, not after what they'd seen. The team advanced slowly toward the cavern. The air grew colder with every step, the torches casting spirals of light across the stones. Tom's breath came in sharp bursts. The earth seemed to hum beneath his boots, a low vibration that climbed into his bones. As they reached the mouth of the chamber, the laughter began again, louder now, surrounding them. But this time, it wasn't only children. It was layered men, women, voices deep and high, hundreds of them, all merging into a chorus that shook the ground. Tom's chest tightened. He gripped his shotgun harder, his voice hoarse. "God help us." Crow lifted her weapon, her jaw set. "No," she said. "God's not here." And with that, they stepped into the dark. The cavern swallowed them whole. The moment Sheriff Tom Harrington stepped beyond the threshold, the air changed. It was colder here, damp and metallic, like the breath of something that had slept for centuries. The torches along the walls flickered with unnatural steadiness, their flames swaying not with drafts, but with rhythm, as if breathing. Spirals had been carved into the clay walls, not once or twice, but thousands of times, interlocking, overlapping, each one etched with obsessive precision. The longer Tom looked at them, the more they seemed to move, turning inward, dragging his eyes toward a center that did not exist. The chamber opened wide, 30 feet across, its ceiling low enough that taller men had to stoop. At its center stood a stone altar, blackened with soot, stained dark with something Tom didn't want to name. Around it, in perfect symmetry, the villagers stood in a circle. Men, women, children, their faces pale, their eyes glowing faintly. They were barefoot, their clothes simple, but their presence was heavier than any soldier Tom had faced in war. Crow raised her weapon, her voice sharp, commanding. "Federal Bureau of Investigation, step away from the altar." No one moved. No one even blinked. Tom felt the skin crawl along his neck. He searched the faces, and there she was, Clara Whitaker, just as he had imagined her from the journal. Her features were unmistakable, though decades should have aged her. She looked neither young nor old, but something in between, her skin pale as paper, her lips curved in a knowing smile. She stepped forward, but her mouth didn't move. The words came from everywhere at once, echoing from the walls, crawling under their skin. "You should not have come." The agent stiffened. Tom's chest clenched. He gripped his shotgun so tight his knuckles whitened. Crow's voice wavered, though she forced authority into it. "Where are the others? What have you done with them?" Clara's pale eyes glowed brighter. "We fed him, and we were remade." The chamber vibrated. A low groan rose from the earth, shaking dust from the ceiling. Tom staggered, his knees nearly buckling. The villagers began to chant softly, a murmur that built into rhythm. Spirals pulsed on the walls, faintly glowing in the torchlight. "Feed him, feed him, feed him." The sound grew louder, echoing until Tom felt his skull rattle. Mark dropped to his knees, hands over his ears, shouting for it to stop. One of the younger agents panicked, firing a burst into the circle. The bullets tore through pale forms, but no one fell. No one bled. The villagers only smiled wider, their chant rising louder. The gunfire died into silence, and then the ground itself seemed to answer. A shape stirred in the shadows behind the altar. Too large for the chamber, it pressed against the walls, its limbs bending at impossible angles. Tom's vision blurred as he tried to comprehend it. Too many arms, too many joints, a body that was less shape than presence. The air grew heavy, suffocating, pressing him toward his knees. One agent screamed, clutching his eyes as if they were burning. Another dropped his rifle and wept openly, clawing at the floor. The villagers' voices merged with the deeper groan, filling the chamber until it felt alive. Tom staggered forward, forcing his voice past the weight in his chest. "Why? Why surrender?" Clara turned her glowing eyes on him. For the first time, he felt the full force of her gaze, and it rooted him to the spot. Her smile widened, too wide, inhuman. Because resistance is worse, because hunger is endless, because he was here long before us, and he will be here long after you. The spirals on the walls flared brighter, pulsing like heartbeats. Tom thought he saw faces in them, mouths open, screaming silently. He shut his eyes, but the images burned against his lids. Crow shouted orders, but her voice was drowned in the cacophony. Agents fired blindly into the dark. The bullets vanished, absorbed into silence. The shape behind the altar grew, its limbs unfurling like roots, stretching across the chamber. One brushed the stone floor, leaving it steaming where it touched. Tom dropped to his knees, his breath ragged. He felt his will slipping, drawn into the spirals, into the chant, into the inevitability of surrender. His father's words echoed in his head, "The mountains hold secrets older than people." And now, those secrets were claiming him. Mark crawled to his side, eyes wild, tears streaming. "Sheriff, we can't fight this. We have to run." Tom wanted to believe him, but his body wouldn't move. The laughter filled his skull, drowning thought, pulling him toward the altar. Clara's voice cut through it, soft but commanding. "Come, join us. You will understand." Tom's legs shifted forward without his consent. He stumbled closer, the weight dragging him step by step. He realized, horrified, that he was smiling, his lips curving without his will. He was becoming one of them. Crow lunged, grabbing his arm, yanking him back. Her eyes blazed, her jaw clenched. "Don't listen," she screamed. "Don't feed it." Her voice cracked something in him. He stumbled back, gasping, the forced smile breaking. But the pull was still there, stronger now. The spirals dragging at his vision, the chant burrowing into his bones. Another agent collapsed, laughing uncontrollably, his voice merging with the chant. He rose slowly, eyes glowing, a smile fixed on his face. He stepped into the circle of villagers, welcomed as though he had always belonged. Crow fired, the gunshot deafening in the enclosed space. The agent fell, but the villagers didn't flinch. The chant only grew louder. Tom forced himself to look at Clara. Her pale glow shimmered. "It is too late. You are already part of him. The moment you entered these woods, you were his." The shape behind the altar surged forward. A limb scraped the ceiling, clay crumbling onto their heads. The torchlight flickered violently. The chamber heaved as though the earth itself was breathing. Dr. Lively shrieked, dropping her notes, her glasses cracking against the stone floor. "It's not just ritual, it's symbiotic. They give themselves willingly. It's a covenant." Crow dragged Tom toward the wall, shouting over the roar, "We need to retreat, now." But the chamber didn't offer retreat. The entrance they had come through was gone, sealed by shifting earth, swallowed into spirals that had grown across the walls. There was no way out. Tom's pulse thundered. He stared at the spirals, realizing with horror that they weren't carvings anymore. They were veins, pulsing with dark light, feeding the thing that stirred behind the altar. The villagers' chant rose to a scream, "Feed him! Feed him! Feed him!" In. The shape pressed closer, its shadow filling every corner, its presence crushing. Tom dropped his shotgun, his knees buckling. He could feel it in his mind now, a voice, not his own, whispering from inside his skull. "Do not resist." Crow grabbed his face, forcing him to look at her. "Stay with me, Sheriff. Stay human." Her words pierced through for a heartbeat. Tom gasped, clinging to that shred of will, but the voice in his head deepened, drowning everything. Hunger is endless. The villagers raised their hands in unison, their glowing eyes fixed on him, on Crow, on Mark. Tom's breath caught. He realized with sick certainty that they weren't going to kill them. They were going to take them, remake them. The altar cracked, stone splitting under pressure. From the fissures seeped a light red, pulsing, alive. The chamber shook, dust raining down. Tom shielded his eyes, but the glow seeped through his hands. He felt it on his skin, in his blood. Mark screamed. Crow shouted his name. And then, from the altar itself, something began to rise. The altar split with a deafening crack. Stone shards rained across the chamber as the floor buckled under the weight of something ancient forcing its way up from beneath. A red glow seeped from the fissures, throbbing like a heartbeat, painting the spirals on the walls in blood-colored light. The villagers chanted louder, their voices rising to a pitch that made Tom Harrington's teeth ache. "Feed him! Feed him! Feed him!" From the broken altar, a shape rose. At first it was only shadow, formless, pulsing with light from within. Then limbs unfolded too many, too long curling like roots across the chamber floor. The air grew heavier, pressing on their chests, forcing Tom to his knees. The presence was overwhelming, not just seen but felt, clawing into his mind. Mark screamed, clutching his head. "It's inside me!" His voice cracked, high and broken. He collapsed onto the stone floor, body convulsing. Crow knelt beside him, shaking his shoulders. "Fight it, Mark. Stay with me." But his eyes rolled back, glowing faintly white. His mouth curved into a smile, not his own. He began to laugh. Tom's heart shattered. He lunged toward his deputy, grabbing his arm, but Mark's laughter grew louder, merging with the villagers' chant. He stood unsteadily, his voice no longer his own, chanting with them. "Feed him! Feed him!" "No," Tom rasped, tears burning his eyes. "Don't you give in, son." But Mark was gone. His face, pale in the red glow, looked serene, peaceful in the most terrifying way. He stepped into the circle, accepted without hesitation. The entity surged higher, its limbs scraping the ceiling, leaving deep grooves in clay and stone. The spirals pulsed brighter, alive, veins feeding its hunger. Tom felt his body dragged forward by an unseen force. His lips trembled as though they wanted to form the chant against his will. Crow grabbed his arm, her face streaked with sweat and grime. "Don't let it in, Sheriff. Don't you dare." Her voice cracked, but her eyes burned with defiance. The villagers raised their hands, pointing at Tom. The glow of their eyes fixed on him, dozens of stares locking him in place. Clara Whitaker stepped forward again, her pale smile, never breaking. "You are chosen. You have always been chosen." The voice wasn't hers. It was older, deeper, crawling through every crack in Tom's soul. His chest heaved. For a heartbeat, surrender seemed easier. To let go, to join, to stop fighting. The hunger pressed against him, promising release. Then he saw Mark's empty smile. He saw the boy he had raised into a deputy, the young man who still said yes sir out of respect, the one who had called him a second father more than once. Gone, hollowed out, laughing like a child. Rage flared in Tom's chest, stronger than fear. He staggered to his feet, shotgun trembling in his hands. You won't take me." His voice cracked but carried. The entity groaned, the sound like 1,000 stones grinding together. Its limbs lashed out, knocking agents into walls like rag dolls. Screams filled the chamber. Crow fired, her rounds vanishing into the mass like pebbles in an ocean. Tom raised his shotgun, aimed not at the entity, but at the altar itself. The cracked stone still glowed, pulsing with the heart of whatever lived beneath. His fingers squeezed the trigger. The blast tore through rock. Shards exploded. The chamber shook violently. The chant faltered for the first time. The villagers shrieked, their voices merging into a sound so piercing Tom dropped to his knees, clutching his ears. Clara's face twisted, her smile breaking into something monstrous. "You cannot resist. Watch me," Tom gasped, pumping the shotgun and firing again. Another blast shattered more of the altar. The glow flared brighter, almost blinding. The entity roared. The spirals on the walls writhed, twisting as though alive, spilling dust from the ceiling. The chamber began to collapse. Agents scrambled, some firing blindly, others clawing at the walls. Crow grabbed Tom's arm, dragging him back. "We have to move. There's no way out," Tom shouted. "We make one." Crow's eyes burned with defiance. The floor split wider, opening into a dark void beneath. Heat and wind blasted upward, carrying whispers that clawed at their ears. The villagers stepped calmly into the fissure, one by one, chanting as they fell, Mark among them. His smile was the last thing Tom saw before the earth swallowed him whole. Tom's chest tore with grief, but there was no time. The chamber buckled. Stones rained down. The entity surged again, rising higher, its limbs stretching toward them. Crow dragged him toward the wall where the earth had cracked. "There, go." Tom stumbled after her, half blind in the red glow. The whispers clawed at his mind, promising peace if he only stopped running. His vision blurred. His ears rang. He nearly collapsed. Crow shoved him through a narrow gap, her voice raw. "Don't stop, Sheriff. Don't you dare stop now." They scrambled upward through clay and roots, the chamber collapsing behind them. The roar of the entity shook the ground, echoing like thunder. The spirals burned in Tom's vision, etched into his skull. They burst into the night air, mud-smeared, gasping, the ridge shuddering beneath their feet. The ground split, swallowing trees, sending rocks tumbling down the slope. Behind them, the cavern mouth collapsed in a roar of dust and stone. The torches vanished. The chanting silenced. Tom collapsed onto the wet earth, coughing, his chest heaving. Crow fell beside him, her face streaked with blood and dirt. For a moment, they just lay there, the night eerily still. Then, from deep within the ridge, the sound came again, faint, distant, high-pitched. Children's laughter. Tom sat up, his body trembling. His throat burned as he whispered, "It's not gone." Crow met his eyes, her face pale, her voice hollow. "It never will be." The laughter echoed once more, drifting through the trees, carried on the wind. And then the forest went silent. Tom looked down at his mud-caked hands, at the blood under his nails, at the shotgun lying useless in the grass. He thought of Clara's final words in her journal. "We fed him. We had no choice." He wondered if one day someone would find his notebook, tucked into a hollow tree, with his final words scrawled across the page. They are still here. The story of Ashwood Hollow is not just a tale of horror or mystery. It is, at its core, a meditation on the weight of memory, the danger of silence, and the choices that define who we are. Beneath the supernatural imagery and the chilling procession of vanished villagers lies something deeply human. Our struggle with fear, conformity, and the temptation to surrender when standing firm seems unbearable. The villagers of Hollow Creek surrendered to an ancient hunger, convincing themselves they had no choice. That decision, whether born of fear, tradition, or blind obedience, echoes with unsettling relevance. How often do we, too, justify our compromises by whispering, "I had no choice"? Whether in small personal battles or in the face of injustice, the story forces us to ask, what does it cost to look away, to let darkness feed, because resisting feels too heavy? Sheriff Harrington's fight, imperfect and desperate, reminds us of the importance of defiance, of holding on to our humanity even when the world presses us to let go. His refusal to surrender, his rage at seeing his deputy hollowed into something unrecognizable, captures the raw truth that resistance often begins, not with courage, but with grief and love. On a broader level, the tale is about inheritance. Just as the villagers inherited rituals of fear, we inherit traditions, wounds, and stories from our past. The question the story leaves us with is simple but profound. Do we pass on fear, or do we pass on strength? Ultimately, Ashwood Hollow teaches us that silence is complicity, and that courage is not the absence of fear but the choice to face it. Darkness may never vanish, but neither does the human will to resist it.